Welcome to Café Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Today, we're diving into the world of Sherlock Holmes with a thrilling tale called The Man with the Paper Teeth. This is a story of murder, deception, and an insurance fraud scheme that only the great detective could unravel. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Man with the Paper Teeth. Chapter 1. An Unusual Breakfast at Simpson's. It was during the latter part of autumn, when the trees in London's parks had shed their summer finery and stood stark against the grey November sky, that I found myself once more in the company of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The morning was bitingly cold, with a thin mist hanging in the air that transformed the gas lamps into ghostly spheres of yellow light as we made our way along the Strand towards Simpson's. Holmes had been engrossed in some abstruse chemical research for the better part of a week, barely emerging from his laboratory corner except to snatch a hasty meal or to perform upon his violin when the mood took him. It was therefore with some surprise that I received his invitation to breakfast that morning. "You see, Watson," said he as we settled ourselves at a table near the window, "a man cannot live on tobacco and mental stimulation alone. Though I have made a fair attempt at it this past week, I find myself in need of both sustenance and your company." "I am flattered," I replied with a smile, "though I suspect your sudden sociability has more to do with the conclusion of your experiments than any particular desire for my conversation." Holmes laughed, his keen grey eyes brightening. "You do me an injustice, my dear fellow. Your presence has the remarkable quality of stimulating my own faculties. You have a knack, Watson, for asking precisely the wrong questions that lead me to the right answers." The waiter brought our breakfast, kippers and toast for Holmes, eggs and a rasher of bacon for myself, and we fell into that comfortable silence that exists only between the oldest of friends. Through the window, I observed the steady stream of humanity passing by. Clerks hurrying to their offices, shop-girls with their parcels, gentlemen of leisure strolling toward their clubs. It was as I was spreading marmalade upon my toast that I noticed a solitary figure enter the café. He was a thin, middle-aged man with a nervous aspect about him. His clothes, though respectable, showed signs of hasty dressing, with his necktie slightly askew and his hat brim bearing the marks of frequent handling. He seated himself at a table not far from our own and ordered tea with trembling hands. Holmes, following my gaze, studied the man with that peculiar intensity I had so often witnessed. "Accountant," he murmured almost to himself. "Been walking the streets for at least 2 hours before coming here. Recently made a decision that weighs heavily upon him." "How could you possibly—" I began, but was interrupted by a curious sound from the neighbouring table. The man had begun to cough violently, clutching at his throat. His teacup clattered to the floor as he rose unsteadily to his feet, his face contorted in a grimace of pain. Before either of us could reach him, he collapsed, overturning his table in a crash of china. Holmes was at his side in an instant, kneeling beside the stricken man. "Stand back! Give him air!" he commanded to the gathering crowd of patrons and waiters. I pushed through to join him, my medical instincts taking over. "Holmes, help me loosen his collar." The man's eyes were wide with terror, his breathing shallow and laboured. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth, and his limbs had begun to twitch in a manner that suggested poisoning rather than any natural seizure. "Watson, look here," Holmes said quietly, pointing to the man's mouth where, to my astonishment, I could see fragments of what appeared to be paper lodged between his teeth. I attempted what medical assistance I could provide, but it was clear that nothing could be done. Within minutes, the man had breathed his last, leaving us surrounded by horrified onlookers and a growing commotion as word of the incident spread through the café. The police arrived promptly, led by a uniformed inspector whom I did not recognize. He questioned us briefly about what we had witnessed, before turning his attention to the deceased's personal effects. "Heart failure, I shouldn't wonder," the inspector pronounced with the casual authority of one accustomed to death. "Happens more often than you'd think. Poor gentleman probably had a weak constitution." I observed Holmes's mouth tighten almost imperceptibly at this diagnosis. While the inspector was occupied with taking statements from the staff, my friend bent swiftly over the body and, with a deftness born of long practice, extracted something from between the dead man's lips. Whatever it was, he slipped it into his waistcoat pocket before anyone could notice. "His name was Harold Whitley," Holmes remarked, examining a card case he had retrieved from the man's coat. "Employed as an accountant at Pemberton and Drake Life Assurance, a respectable position." "You seem to know a great deal about him already," I commented as we were finally permitted to leave after giving our account. Holmes hailed a hansom cab before replying. "The ink stains on his right middle finger and cuff are characteristic of those who work with ledgers. His attire speaks of modest means but professional standing, and the callus on his writing finger suggests long hours with a pen." He paused as we climbed into the cab. "But what interests me far more, Watson, is why an accountant for a life assurance company would spend his final moments desperately attempting to consume pages from what appears to be his own journal." "Good heavens, Holmes. Are you certain?" My friend reached into his pocket and partially revealed a soggy scrap of paper. "Baker Street," he called to the driver, then turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eyes. "The game is afoot, Watson, and it begins with the curious case of the man with paper teeth." Chapter 2. The Curious Case of the Masticated Pages. It was near midday by the time we returned to our lodgings in Baker Street. The fog had thickened considerably during our journey, muffling the sounds of the city and transforming familiar landmarks into spectral outlines. Holmes had maintained a thoughtful silence throughout our ride, his keen features set in that expression of intense concentration which I had come to recognize as a sign that his remarkable brain was already at work upon the problem. No sooner had we entered our sitting room than he threw off his coat and, extracting the sodden paper fragment from his pocket, carried it with delicate care to his chemical corner. Mrs. Hudson, who had evidently heard our arrival, appeared with an inquiry about luncheon, but Holmes waved her away with uncharacteristic impatience. "Not now, Mrs. Hudson. I shall not require anything until this evening. Watson, however, might appreciate something light in an hour or so." "Really, Holmes," I protested. "After such a disturbing morning, I find my appetite quite diminished." "Nonsense," he replied, already busy with his collection of reagents and test tubes. "The workings of your digestive system have never been influenced by the workings of your mind. It is one of your most reliable characteristics." I settled into my armchair with the morning's paper, though in truth I paid little attention to its contents. Instead, I watched as Holmes subjected the paper to a variety of tests, applying drops of different solutions and examining the results under his powerful lens. From time to time, he would mutter to himself or make a brief note in his memorandum book. "Curious," he said at length, straightening up from his microscope. "Most curious indeed." "What have you discovered?" I inquired, setting aside the newspaper. Holmes held up the fragment which he had carefully dried. "This, Watson, is a page from a personal journal. The quality of the paper and the traces of binding adhesive along one edge make that clear. But more significantly, it bears faint traces of a rather uncommon poison." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. Then the poor fellow was murdered. That would be the most obvious conclusion, Holmes agreed, though it does not explain why he would be consuming his own writings. The poison itself is interesting, an organic compound derived from certain tropical plants. It acts rapidly on the nervous system, producing the symptoms we observed. But who would want to murder an accountant? I wondered aloud. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Therein lies our mystery, Watson. In my experience, when an accountant meets a violent end, one would do well to examine the books he kept. He was interrupted by a sharp knock at our door. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. The little detective looked more ferret-like than ever as he entered, his sharp eyes darting about the room before settling on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted with a nod. "Dr. Watson, I might have known I'd find you mixed up in this business." "What business would that be, Lestrade?" Holmes inquired innocently, though I noticed he had deftly covered the paper fragment with a handkerchief. Lestrade sniffed. "The death at Simpson's this morning. The manager mentioned you were present. Just a courtesy call, you understand, to see if you noticed anything unusual." "How thoughtful of you to consult me," Holmes said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I was under the impression your colleague had declared it natural causes." "Yes, well," Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "That was Inspector Gregson's initial assessment. However, certain details have come to light which suggest otherwise." "Such as?" "The deceased, Mr. Harold Whitley, had been acting strangely at his place of employment. His colleagues at Pemberton and Drake report that he had become increasingly agitated over the past fortnight. He was seen working late, locking documents in his desk, and, on one occasion, arguing with Mr. Drake himself." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, Lestrade, what were Mr. Whitley's duties at the firm?" "He was senior accountant, responsible for auditing their life insurance claims." Lestrade consulted his notebook. "Been with them 15 years, impeccable record. Wife says he was devoted to his work, never missed a day until recently, when he began complaining of feeling unwell. And yet he chose to breakfast at Simpson's this morning, rather than remain at home," Holmes mused. "Interesting." "There's something else," Lestrade added hesitantly. "The police surgeon found traces of paper in his mouth and throat, almost as if he'd been eating it. Most irregular?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Most irregular indeed. Have you formed any theory?" "Well," Lestrade said, "it's possible the man was deranged. Mental disturbance, perhaps brought on by overwork. These accountant types often have fragile constitutions, all those numbers, you know." I saw Holmes suppress a smile. "A fascinating diagnosis, Inspector. Is there anything else you can tell us about Mr. Whitley?" "Only that his desk at Pemberton and Drake has been thoroughly searched, but nothing unusual was found. His wife mentioned he kept a journal, but it wasn't among his effects." "A journal?" Holmes repeated with apparent casualness. "How interesting. We shall certainly let you know if anything occurs to us that might assist your investigation." After Lestrade had departed, Holmes sprang into action. "Quick, Watson, your hat and coat. We must visit Mrs. Whitley without delay." "But what about the paper fragment?" I asked, reaching for my things. Holmes carefully folded the piece of evidence into his pocketbook. "I've learned all I can from it for the moment. What we need now is the rest of the journal from which it came." As we descended the steps to the street, I ventured another question. "You didn't tell Lestrade about the poison?" "Nor about the nature of the paper," Holmes added. "There is more at work here than a simple poisoning, Watson. Whitley was trying to destroy evidence he had recorded in his own hand. But why consume it rather than burn it? No, there are depths to this case that we have not yet begun to plumb." He paused on the doorstep, his face illuminated briefly by a shaft of pale sunlight breaking through the fog. and I rather fancy that the answers await us in the home of the late Mr. Harold Whitley, accountant to Pemberton and Drake Life Assurance, a man driven to eat his own words. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. The Whitley residence was situated in one of those quiet suburban streets which have sprung up in such profusion around the expanding metropolis. It was a modest semi-detached villa, its small front garden neat but unadorned, speaking of limited means, carefully managed. As we approached the gate, I observed the blinds had been drawn as a mark of the household's sudden bereavement. "A respectable home for a man of Whitley's position," Holmes remarked as we waited upon the doorstep. "Note the polished brass, Watson, and the freshly swept path, signs of an orderly mind or an orderly wife, possibly both." Our summons was answered by a maidservant with reddened eyes who led us into a small but well-appointed sitting-room where Mrs. Whitley awaited us. She was a slight, fair-haired woman of about 40, her features bearing that stunned expression which so often accompanies sudden grief. She rose as we entered, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, extending her hand. "The police inspector mentioned you witnessed my husband's—" Her voice faltered momentarily. "My husband's passing." "Indeed, madam, and may I offer my sincere condolences," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic gentleness. "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson, who also attempted to render assistance." "I am grateful to you both," she said, gesturing for us to be seated. The inspector was not forthcoming with details. "Perhaps you might tell me what occurred. I need to understand." I glanced at Holmes, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, and so I recounted the events at Simpson's as tactfully as I could manage. Mrs. Whitley listened with admirable composure, though her fingers worked ceaselessly at a handkerchief in her lap. "Had your husband been troubled recently, Mrs. Whitley?" Holmes inquired when I had finished. A shadow crossed her face. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Harold had not been himself these past few weeks. He had always been so punctual, so methodical in his habits, but lately—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Lately he had become distracted, anxious. He would stay late at the office, sometimes returning long after I had retired. When I questioned him, he would dismiss my concerns, saying it was merely end-of-quarter accounting matters." "Did you believe him?" Holmes asked, sharply. Mrs. Whitley hesitated. "I wanted to, but after 20 years of marriage one develops an instinct." She met Holmes's gaze directly. "No, Mr. Holmes, I did not believe him. Something was troubling Harold deeply, something he felt he could not share, even with me." "Did he keep a journal, Mrs. Whitley?" Holmes inquired, his tone casual, though I knew the question was anything but. "Yes, he did. For many years. Harold believed in maintaining a record of his thoughts and observations. He felt it improved his recall." A frown creased her brow. "How did you know about the journal?" "A professional hazard, madam. I tend to notice the calluses particular to those who write regularly." Holmes leaned forward. "Might we see this journal?" "That's just it, Mr. Holmes. I cannot find it. Harold kept it in his study, but when I looked this morning, after the police had gone, it was missing, along with certain papers from his desk." She twisted the handkerchief in her fingers. "Harold was very particular about his private papers. He had recently taken to locking them away." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "May we see his study, Mrs. Whitley?" She led us to a small room at the rear of the house, simply furnished with a desk, bookcase, and comfortable reading chair. It bore the hallmarks of a practical man's sanctuary. Orderly shelves, precisely arranged writing implements, a well-worn leather blotter. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, his quick eyes scanning its surface. "The drawer has been forced," he murmured, indicating where the small lock had been broken. "The police did that," Mrs. Whitley explained. "They insisted it was necessary." Holmes opened the drawer, revealing a collection of ordinary household accounts and correspondence. "Nothing of note," he remarked, closing it again. "Did your husband mention anything specific about his work that troubled him? Any particular case or client?" Mrs. Whitley shook her head, then paused. "Not directly, but I recall him muttering something about rotten foundations about a fortnight ago. When I asked what he meant, he looked startled, as if he hadn't realized he'd spoken aloud. He said it was nothing, merely a structural issue with the office building." Her eyes clouded. "I knew it was more than that." While Holmes continued his examination of the study, I attempted to steer our conversation toward more practical matters. "Mrs. Whitley, may I ask about your financial situation? Will you be provided for?" "Harold was prudent, Doctor. We have modest savings, and there is a small life insurance policy with his company." She smiled wanly. "We have no children to consider, thankfully." At that moment, we were interrupted by the maid-servant bearing a telegram on a small silver tray. Mrs. Whitley read it, her expression shifting from puzzlement to surprise. "How very strange," she said, handing the telegram to Holmes. "It's from Pemberton and Drake. They are offering an immediate payment of £500 as a special benefaction, separate from any insurance claim." Holmes scanned the message, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Unusually generous of them," he commented. "Would you say such benefactions are standard practice at the firm?" "Not to my knowledge," she replied. "Harold never mentioned such arrangements for other employees' families." "Most interesting," Holmes murmured, pocketing the telegram before I could read it. "Mrs. Whitley, with your permission, we should like to visit your husband's place of employment. There may be clues there to his state of mind in recent weeks." As we took our leave, promising to return if we discovered anything of significance, Holmes paused in the doorway. "One last question, if I may. Did your husband have any enemies that you know of? Anyone who might wish him harm?" Mrs. Whitley looked genuinely startled at the suggestion. "Harold? No, Mr. Holmes, he was the gentlest of men, devoted to his work and his principles. He often said that in the insurance business, integrity was everything." A shadow crossed her face. "Though recently he did say something odd. He told me that sometimes knowing too much about numbers could be dangerous." As we made our way back toward the main road in search of a cab, I could contain my curiosity no longer. "What do you make of it, Holmes? The missing journal, the forced drawer, this unexpected benefaction?" Holmes's lips compressed into a thin line as he hailed an approaching hansom. "What I make of it, Watson, is that Harold Whitley was a man who discovered something in his company's accounts, something that someone was willing to kill for." He handed me into the cab before following. "To Pemberton and Drake Life Assurance, driver. And make haste." Chapter 4. The Insurance Men. The offices of Pemberton and Drake Life Assurance occupied the upper floors of an imposing Portland stone building in the city, its facade bearing the weight of respectability that is the hallmark of financial institutions. As we ascended the broad marble staircase, I observed Holmes's keen eyes taking in every detail of our surroundings, the polished brass fixtures, the oak-panelled walls, the hushed atmosphere of moneyed discretion. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured as we reached the landing, "how the carpet on the stairs is more worn on the right side than the left. It suggests that more people descend than ascend these stairs, which in turn suggests that clients are more eager to leave than to arrive." "Perhaps they simply follow the natural custom of keeping to the right," I offered. Holmes smiled thinly. "Perhaps, but I have found that in establishments where clients depart with satisfaction, The ware is more evenly distributed. Now, let us see what manner of welcome awaits us. We were received in an outer office by a clerk who, upon hearing Holmes's name, betrayed a flicker of recognition before ushering us through to a handsomely appointed boardroom. There we were kept waiting for several minutes, a delay which Holmes utilized by making a circuit of the room, his gaze lingering on the various diplomas and certificates that adorned the walls. Founded in 1856, he remarked, weathered the financial crisis of '66 without apparent difficulty. Interesting. Before I could inquire further, the door opened to admit two gentlemen. The first was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the ruddy complexion of one who enjoys the pleasures of the table. The second was a leaner, more austere figure, with cold eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set in an expression of mild disapproval. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the first man exclaimed, advancing with hand outstretched. "I am Pemberton, and this is my partner, Mr. Drake. We are, of course, familiar with your reputation, though I confess I am puzzled as to the nature of your interest in our firm." Holmes accepted the handshake with a cordial nod. "We are investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of your employee, Mr. Harold Whitley." A shadow crossed Pemberton's jovial features. "A terrible business, quite shocking. Poor Whitley was one of our most valued employees. 15 years of service, wasn't it, Drake?" 17, Drake corrected coldly, "though I fail to see how his unfortunate demise warrants the attention of a private detective." "Then you are aware of the manner of his passing?" Holmes inquired. "The police informed us that he collapsed in a public establishment," Drake replied. "Heart failure, we were told." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And yet your firm has already dispatched a most generous benefaction to his widow. £500, I believe, considerable sum for a case of natural death." Pemberton and Drake exchanged a swift glance before the former cleared his throat. "We value loyalty, Mr. Holmes. Whitley's long service merited recognition, particularly given the sudden nature of his departure." "I see," said Holmes. "And was Mr. Whitley engaged in any particular projects of late that might have caused him undue strain?" Drake's thin lips compressed even further. "Nothing beyond his ordinary duties, routine auditing of our accounts and claims." "We would like to speak with his assistant, if we may," Holmes continued smoothly, "and perhaps examine his workspace." "I hardly think—" Drake began, but Pemberton interjected with forced heartiness. Of course. We have nothing to hide. I'll have someone show you to Whitley's office. His assistant, Perkins, should be there. Poor lad is quite distraught, as you might imagine." As we followed a clerk through a maze of corridors, I leaned closer to Holmes. "What do you make of them?" I whispered. "Pemberton plays the genial host while Drake watches from the shadows," Holmes replied quietly. "A common arrangement in partnerships of this nature. Note how quick they were to grant our request. A guilty conscience often manifests as excessive accommodation." Whitley's office proved to be a small, efficient space dominated by a large desk buried beneath ledgers and files. A young man of perhaps 25 rose nervously as we entered, his pale features and red-rimmed eyes testifying to recent distress. "Mr. Perkins?" Holmes inquired. "We understand you were Mr. Whitley's assistant." "Yes, sir," the young man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you from the police?" "Consulting detectives," Holmes corrected. "Tell me, Mr. Perkins, did you notice any change in Mr. Whitley's behavior in recent weeks?" Perkins glanced anxiously toward the door. Mr. Whitley was concerned about certain discrepancies he had found. "What sort of discrepancies?" Holmes prompted. "In the ledgers, sir, particularly regarding policyholder deaths and payment records." Perkins hesitated. "He had me pull files on several cases from the archives, old cases, some dating back 5 years or more. Do you recall any specific cases? I asked. The young man shook his head. Mr. Whitley kept his own notes, but I know he was particularly interested in policies with large payouts where the policyholder died unexpectedly. Holmes had begun to examine the desk, his fingers running lightly over the blotter. And where might these files be now, Mr. Perkins? That's just it, sir. They're gone. When I arrived this morning, the special files he'd been reviewing had been returned to the archives. Perkins lowered his voice further. And there were pages missing from the ledgers, as though someone had removed them. While Holmes continued his scrutiny of the office, I questioned Perkins further about Whitley's daily routine and habits. The young man was eager to help, but clearly frightened, his eyes constantly darting to the door as though expecting interruption. Our conversation was indeed interrupted, but not by either of the partners. Instead, a tall, broad-shouldered man with the hard eyes of a pugilist appeared in the doorway, regarding us with undisguised hostility. "Mr. Grimshaw?" Perkins said, visibly shrinking. "These gentlemen are—" "I know who they are," Grimshaw cut in. "Mr. Drake has asked me to inform you that your presence is disrupting the day's business. I am to escort you out." Holmes straightened up from his examination of a wastebasket. Mr. Grimshaw? Head clerk, I presume? Or perhaps you serve in some other capacity for Pemberton and Drake?" Something dangerous flashed in Grimshaw's eyes. "I ensure the smooth running of this firm, Mr. Holmes, in whatever capacity required." "Fascinating," Holmes replied with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "We were just concluding our visit. Please convey our thanks to your employers." As we descended the stairs toward the exit, I remarked, "That was a hasty departure. Did you discover anything of value?" Holmes waited until we were safely ensconced in a cab before answering. "Several things, Watson. First, that young Perkins is terrified, and not merely by the death of his employer. Second, that important documentation has disappeared. And third," he reached into his pocket and withdrew a crumpled sheet of paper, "that Mr. Whitley was tracking a pattern of highly profitable deaths among their policyholders." "Where did you find that?" I exclaimed. "In the wastebasket?" "A fragment only, but most illuminating." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light that I knew so well. "We have scratched the surface, Watson, and already the facade begins to crumble. What was it Mrs. Whitley said her husband had mentioned? Ah, yes, rotten foundations. It seems the late Mr. Whitley was a man of both literal and figurative speech." Chapter 5. The Missing Diary. It was well past midnight when we found ourselves once more in Baker Street after a long evening spent in consultation. Holmes had been unusually reticent during our cab ride home, smoking incessantly with that distant look in his eyes which told me his mind was grappling with the tangled threads of our investigation. "You are uncharacteristically quiet, Watson," he remarked suddenly as we settled before the dying fire in our sitting room. "I can almost hear the questions forming in your mind." I smiled, despite my weariness. "I confess I am somewhat at a loss. We have a dead accountant, a missing journal, and business partners who seem excessively eager to close the matter with a generous payment, but how these elements connect—" "Precisely," Holmes interjected, reaching for his pipe. "The connections, Watson, that is where our attention must focus." He leaned forward, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his hawk-like features. "What we lack is Whitley's journal, the repository of his observations and suspicions. Without it, we are navigating by glimpses rather than by chart." "But surely the journal is lost," I pointed out. "If it was not at his home nor at his office." "Is it your habit to keep your most private thoughts where others might easily discover them?" Holmes asked with a thin smile. No, Watson. A man who feared for his safety enough to consume pages of his own writing, rather than let them fall into the wrong hands, would have taken precautions. Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace, his dressing gown billowing behind him. Consider what we know of Harold Whitley, a methodical man, precise in his habits, an accountant by profession and by nature. Such a man does not trust to memory alone. He documents, he records, he preserves evidence. I stifled a yawn, but where would he hide such evidence if not at home or work? That, said Holmes, pausing by the window to gaze down at the fog-shrouded street, is what we shall discover tonight. Get your revolver, Watson. We have an appointment with a dead man's secrets. An hour later found us approaching Whitley's office building from a narrow side street. The city, so bustling by day, lay silent and deserted in the small hours, our footsteps echoing between the walls of darkened commercial establishments. Holmes had exchanged his dressing gown for a dark coat and soft-soled shoes, and I had my service revolver secure in my pocket. "The night watchman makes his rounds every hour," Holmes whispered, as we reached a service entrance. "He's due at the front entrance in approximately 5 minutes, which gives us our opportunity." I watched in amazement as Holmes produced a set of slim metal tools and deftly manipulated the lock. "I had no idea you possessed such skills," I murmured. "A necessary part of my education, Watson. There are times when justice requires methods that the law might frown upon." The lock yielded with a soft click, and we slipped inside, Holmes's small, dark lantern providing just enough illumination to navigate the deserted corridors. The building seemed transformed at night, familiar objects casting strange shadows, the silence heavy and expectant. "This way," Holmes breathed, leading me unerringly toward Whitley's office. "Remember, Watson, we seek not the obvious hiding place, but the one that would occur to an accountant's orderly mind." Whitley's office was just as we had left it earlier that day, save for the unnatural stillness that pervades all workplaces after hours. Holmes immediately began a methodical search, his fingers probing beneath drawers, testing panels, measuring spaces with his practiced eye. "Nothing," he muttered after several minutes. He would not have hidden it here, where Grimshaw or the partners might easily discover it. Think, Watson. If you were Whitley, where would you secure your most damning evidence? I glanced around the office, trying to put myself in the dead man's place. Perhaps in the archives, amidst the older files that Perkins mentioned. Possible, but too accessible to others, Holmes replied, continuing his examination. No, he would choose somewhere both secure and meaningful to him personally, somewhere that— He broke off suddenly, a peculiar expression crossing his face. "Of course. How elementary. Watson, help me move this cabinet." Together we shifted a heavy filing cabinet away from the wall, revealing nothing but dusty floorboards. Holmes knelt, running his fingers along the baseboard until they caught on a barely perceptible irregularity. With a satisfied grunt, he pressed what appeared to be an ordinary knot in the wood. A small section of the baseboard swung outward, revealing a hollow space behind. "Ingenious," I breathed as Holmes reached into the cavity and withdrew a leather-bound volume. "His journal?" "Indeed, and look here." Holmes indicated several pages that had been torn from the binding. Pages are missing, corresponding to the fragment found in his mouth. Whitley was attempting to destroy crucial evidence when he was interrupted, or when the poison began to take effect. Our examination was suddenly interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. Holmes swiftly replaced the cabinet while I extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness. "The watchman," Holmes whispered. "Quick, behind the door." We pressed ourselves against the wall as the door opened, and a beam of light swept across the room. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my hand tightening around the revolver in my pocket. The watchman paused on the threshold, his lantern illuminating the apparently undisturbed office. For a moment I feared discovery, but then he grunted softly and withdrew, continuing his rounds. "A close call," I murmured when the footsteps had faded. "Indeed, and we shall have an even closer one if we linger," Holmes replied, tucking the journal inside his coat. "We have what we came for." Our escape proved less eventful than our entry, and within half an hour we were once more ensconced in our Baker Street quarters. Holmes immediately settled by the lamp and began to examine the journal, turning pages with careful fingers. "Most of the entries appear to be routine observations of daily life," he noted after several minutes. "But here, beginning approximately 6 weeks ago, the tone changes. Listen to this. Reviewed Langford policy today. Third case this quarter with similar pattern. Too consistent to be coincidence." Holmes continued scanning the pages. "And here. D became quite agitated when I requested the Mortimer files. Claims they were misfiled. Convenient explanation. It seems Whitley was indeed investigating suspicious patterns in the company's business," I observed. "More than that, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice tense with excitement. "He was documenting a systematic fraud and encoding the details in a manner that only he could decipher." He held up a page covered in what appeared to be random numbers arranged in columns. "This, I believe, is the key to the entire mystery." Holmes spent the remainder of the night hunched over the journal, making notes, consulting reference books, and occasionally muttering to himself. As dawn broke, casting pale fingers of light through our windows, he finally sat back with an expression of grim satisfaction. "We have him, Watson," he said quietly. "We have the means to bring a murderer to justice, but we must move carefully, for our quarry is both dangerous and desperate." "What do you propose?" I asked, stifling a yawn after our sleepless night. Holmes closed the journal with decisive fingers. "First, we must secure this evidence where it cannot be found or destroyed. Then we shall visit the bank. For it is there, Watson, that we shall find the final threads of this web of deceit." Chapter 6. The Web of Deceit. The following morning dawned grey and cheerless, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to wash all colour from the London streets. I awoke to find Holmes already dressed and breakfasted, poring over Whitley's journal with the intense concentration that he brought to all his investigations. The dark circles beneath his eyes testified to a night spent largely without sleep. "Ah, Watson, you're awake at last," he said, glancing up from his work. "I trust you slept well despite our nocturnal adventure." "Tolerably," I replied, reaching for the coffee pot. "Have you made progress with the journal?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture of his. Indeed, Whitley was more clever than his employers gave him credit for. He disguised his discoveries as ordinary accounting notations, meaningless to the casual observer, but quite revealing when one applies the appropriate cipher. "And what has he revealed?" I inquired, helping myself to toast and marmalade. "A most ingenious scheme of fraud, Watson." Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his energy seemingly undiminished by his vigil. "Consider the business of life assurance. Its foundation rests upon the calculation of risk, the statistical probability of death within a given period. Policies are priced accordingly, with higher premiums for those deemed at greater risk." I nodded, familiar with the general concept. "And Pemberton and Drake were manipulating these calculations?" "Far worse," Holmes replied, his voice hardening. "They were manipulating the outcomes. Whitley's journal documents a pattern spanning at least 5 years. Certain policyholders with particularly large policies would suffer unexpected deaths shortly after their coverage began." I nearly choked on my coffee. Are you suggesting they were arranging the deaths of their own clients? Precisely, Watson. Select clients would be approached, usually wealthy individuals with no close family, but with significant debts or financial difficulties. They would be persuaded to take out substantial policies with the firm. But who would be named as beneficiary? I asked, trying to follow the logic of this grim scheme. In most cases, a distant relative or business associate, Holmes explained, consulting his notes, someone who could be relied upon to share the proceeds. The policyholder would be led to believe they were participating in a mere insurance fraud, that they would simply disappear, assume a new identity abroad, while the policy was paid out and the money shared. But instead they were actually killed, I said, the full horror of the scheme becoming clear. Indeed, the disappearance would become permanent, the beneficiary would collect, and a substantial portion would flow back to the architects of the scheme. Holmes's face was grim. Whitley identified 6 such cases before he himself became the 7th victim. I pushed my plate away, my appetite gone. How did he discover it? He was responsible for auditing claims, remember? Over time, he noticed statistical anomalies, too many large policies paying out too quickly. He began investigating individual cases, connecting the pattern of payments flowing back to entities associated with Pemberton and Drake. Holmes showed me a page of the journal where Whitley had meticulously tracked large sums transferred from various policy beneficiaries to a series of numbered accounts. This is what we must verify today at the City and Colonial Bank, where Pemberton and Drake conduct their business. An hour later found us seated in the office of Mr. Weatherby, a senior manager at the bank. He was a precise little man with gold-rimmed spectacles and the cautious manner of one who has spent a lifetime guarding other people's money. I must emphasize, Mr. Holmes, that our client's financial affairs are strictly confidential, he said, repeatedly polishing his spectacles with a silk handkerchief. Without proper authorization. Perhaps this will serve as authorization, Holmes interjected, producing an official-looking document. A request from Scotland Yard regarding a murder investigation. I concealed my surprise, knowing full well that Lestrade had provided no such document. Weatherby, however, examined it with nervous attention before reluctantly nodding. Very well. What information do you require? I need to trace a series of payments made to this account over the past 5 years, Holmes said, sliding a paper across the desk. Specifically, large deposits followed by substantial transfers to this secondary account. Weatherby consulted his ledgers, occasionally making notes as he cross-referenced various entries. The process was lengthy, and I found my attention wandering to the window where the rain continued to lash against the glass. Here we are, Weatherby said at last. There have indeed been numerous substantial deposits to the first account, each followed within days by a transfer of approximately 60% of the sum to the second account. And who controls the second account? Holmes asked, leaning forward intently. Weatherby hesitated. It is a corporate account for a company called Orpheus Holdings. With registered directors, Holmes prompted. The paperwork shows a Mr. James Smith as primary director, Weatherby replied, frowning slightly. Though I must say I've never met the gentleman. I would be surprised if you had, Holmes murmured. And where are the transferred funds ultimately directed? More consultation of ledgers followed before Weatherby replied. The majority appear to be withdrawn in cash or transferred to continental banks. Most recently, substantial sums have been directed to a private bank in Switzerland. Holmes sat back with a satisfied expression. Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. You have been most helpful. As we departed the bank, I couldn't contain my curiosity any longer. Orpheus Holdings? Is that significant? Orpheus Watson, the mythological figure who journeyed to the underworld and returned, Holmes replied. A rather poetic choice for a company dealing in death and resurrection, wouldn't you say? As for Mr. James Smith, I would wager a month's rent that no such person exists, at least not as described in the banking documents. Then who is behind it all? I asked, as we hailed a cab. Holmes's expression grew sombre. That is what we must determine before another victim is claimed. The mastermind of this scheme has already murdered Whitley to protect their secret. They will not hesitate to strike again if they suspect we are closing in. What is our next step? I asked. We must follow the poison, Holmes replied cryptically. Whitley's death was no ordinary poisoning. The substance used is rare and difficult to obtain. There are perhaps 3 chemists in London capable of producing it. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase. And I believe I know which establishment we should visit first. As our cab rattled eastward through the increasingly disreputable streets, I checked that my revolver was secure in my pocket. Holmes had fallen silent, his mind clearly racing ahead, assembling the pieces of this deadly puzzle. "Be on your guard, Watson," he said finally as the cab slowed. "We're about to enter the lair of a man who traffics in death, and if I am right, we shall soon know the face of the spider at the center of this web of deceit." Chapter 7. The Poison Maker. Our cab deposited us in one of the most unwholesome districts of London's East End, where the Thames fog mingled with coal smoke to create a noxious yellow haze that clung to the buildings like a disease. Holmes led the way down a narrow, cobbled lane barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, past dingy shop fronts with grimy windows that revealed little of the business conducted within. "The establishment we seek has no sign," Holmes remarked, as we picked our way carefully through the filth underfoot. Its proprietor, one Cyrus Maddox, prefers discretion in his dealings. He is ostensibly an apothecary, but his true expertise lies in the creation of substances not found in any official pharmacopoeia. "How do you know of him?" I inquired, keeping a wary eye on a group of rough-looking men lounging at the corner ahead. "I have had occasion to consult him in the past on certain technical matters," Holmes replied cryptically. "Maddox possesses an encyclopedic knowledge of exotic poisons and their effects. If the substance used on Whitley was procured in London, Maddox will either have supplied it or know who did." We halted before an unremarkable door set deep in a weathered brick facade. A small, tarnished brass plate bearing only the initial M was its sole distinguishing feature. Holmes rapped sharply upon the wood with his walking stick. After a moment, we heard the scrape of a panel being withdrawn, and a pair of bloodshot eyes regarded us suspiciously through the narrow aperture. "I seek a consultation with Mr. Maddox," Holmes announced in a firm voice. "Tell him Sherlock Holmes requires 5 minutes of his time." The panel slid shut, and there followed a prolonged silence, broken only by the distant cry of a street vendor and the scuttling of a rat across the alley. Just as I began to think we had been ignored, the sound of multiple bolts being withdrawn preceded the door's opening, revealing a sallow-faced youth who beckoned us inside without a word. We were led through a dimly lit shop, lined with shelves of bottles and jars containing powders and liquids of various hues, each meticulously labelled in a cramped, precise hand. The air was heavy with the commingled odours of chemicals and herbs, some familiar, others exotic and unsettling. In a back room illuminated by a skylight of dubious cleanliness, we found Cyrus Maddox hunched over a workbench. He was a cadaverous figure with skin like yellowed parchment stretched over prominent bones, as though he had absorbed over the years the properties of the toxins he concocted. His long, thin fingers manipulated a set of brass scales with delicate precision. "Sherlock Holmes," he said, without looking up, his voice a dry whisper like the rustling of dead leaves. "It has been some time. I trust this is not an official visit?" That depends entirely upon you, Maddox, Holmes replied coolly. I require information regarding a particular poison used in a murder this week. Maddox carefully set down his instruments and turned to face us, his sunken eyes revealing nothing. You know my terms, Mr. Holmes. I do not discuss my clients. Even those who commit murder, I interjected, unable to contain my indignation. A thin smile creased the apothecary's bloodless lips. The applications of my products are not my concern, Doctor. Watson, is it not? I merely supply tools. How they are employed is beyond my purview. Perhaps, said Holmes, you might make an exception in this case, considering that the alternative would be a thorough investigation of your premises by Scotland Yard. I imagine Inspector Lestrade would find much to interest him here. Maddox's smile vanished. What poison are you inquiring about? Holmes removed from his pocket a small vial containing a trace of the substance he had extracted from the paper fragment. Analysis reveals it to be derived from a tropical plant, refined using a process known to very few in England. Maddox examined the vial, uncorking it briefly to sniff its contents before nodding slowly. Rauwolfia serpentina combined with certain alkaloids, a most effective compound. Death appears to result from cardiac failure, virtually indistinguishable from natural causes except to the most discerning pathologist. As I suspected, Holmes said. And to whom have you supplied this preparation recently? Maddox hesitated, his fingers working nervously upon the sleeve of his stained frock coat. I maintain no written records, Mr. Holmes. Such practices would be imprudent. Your memory, I am sure, is excellent, Holmes insisted, a hint of steel entering his voice. The apothecary sighed. Very well, I prepared such a compound twice in the past month. Once for a gentleman who claimed to be a researcher studying its effects upon rodent populations. And his appearance? Holmes prompted. Tall, lean, with cold eyes and a most precise manner of speech, Maddox replied. He paid handsomely for my discretion. Drake, I murmured to Holmes, who nodded almost imperceptibly. And the second purchaser? He inquired. That is the curious thing, Maddox said, leaning forward slightly. It was the same gentleman, but he did not present himself as such. He wore different attire, affected a different accent, but certain mannerisms cannot be disguised from a careful observer. Most interesting, Holmes remarked. And when was this second purchase made? 3 days ago, Maddox replied. He seemed agitated, impatient, insisted upon taking the preparation immediately, though it was not yet properly distilled. Holmes's eyes gleamed. One final question, Maddox. Did this gentleman ever mention Pemberton and Drake Life Assurance, or a Mr. Harold Whitley? A flicker of surprise crossed the apothecary's gaunt features. He mentioned no names, but on his second visit he left behind a torn page that had fallen from his pocket. I intended to dispose of it, but have not yet done so. Maddox shuffled to a cluttered desk and retrieved a crumpled paper which he handed to Holmes. As Holmes scrutinized the paper, the door suddenly burst open to admit Inspector Lestrade, accompanied by 2 constables. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade exclaimed, "your message reached me at the Yard. I came as quickly as possible." Holmes looked up from the paper with a satisfied expression. "Excellent timing, Lestrade. You may place Mr. Maddox under arrest for his role in supplying the poison that killed Harold Whitley." As the constables secured the protesting apothecary, Holmes drew me aside. "We must make haste, Watson. This page is from a letter addressed to Mrs. Whitley, a letter I suspect her husband sent shortly before his death." "What does it say?" I asked. "Only a partial address, but enough to suggest that Whitley mailed a package to his wife as insurance against his own demise." Holmes's expression was grave. "If I am correct, and Drake has realized the same, Mrs. Whitley may be in grave danger." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the East End. Should we not accompany Lestrade to arrest Drake as well? Drake is but one thread in this web, Holmes replied, hailing a passing cab. I fear there are others equally dangerous, Mrs. Whitley's residence driver and spare no speed. As our cab clattered through the streets of London, I checked my revolver once more. Do you think Mrs. Whitley has already received this package? I pray that she has, Holmes answered, his face set in grim lines, and that we are not too late to prevent another tragedy in this sordid affair. Chapter 8. Justice at Baker Street. It was with no small relief that we found Mrs. Whitley not only alive but under the protective watch of her sister, who had arrived from the country upon news of her brother-in-law's death. More significant still was the letter which had indeed arrived for Mrs. Whitley 2 days prior, a letter mailed by her husband on the very day of his demise. He seemed most insistent that I should not open it unless something happened to him, Mrs. Whitley explained, handing the sealed envelope to Holmes. He said it contained information that might prove dangerous. Your husband was a prudent man, Holmes remarked, carefully breaking the seal, and now his foresight may well bring his killers to justice. Within the envelope we found a folded sheet containing what appeared to be a meaningless sequence of numbers, along with a brief note in Whitley's precise hand. The key is in our wedding date. The names are those who must answer for their crimes. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he studied the cipher. The final piece of our puzzle, Watson. With this we can complete the case, but we must act quickly. Mrs. Whitley, I must ask you to accompany us to Baker Street this evening. Your safety cannot be guaranteed here. That evening found our sitting room at 221 B Baker Street transformed into an impromptu court of justice. At Holmes's instruction I had dispatched telegrams to several parties requesting their presence at 8 o'clock on a matter of grave importance. Mrs. Hudson had been prevailed upon to serve refreshments, though I noted she did so with the air of one who disapproved of such irregular proceedings at such an hour. Our first arrivals were Inspector Lestrade and 2 plainclothes officers who positioned themselves discreetly by the windows. Next came Mr. Pemberton, his usually florid face now ashen with apprehension, followed shortly thereafter by the austere figure of Mr. Drake, whose cold eyes betrayed no emotion as he acknowledged our presence with a curt nod. I trust, Mr. Holmes, that you have good reason for this unorthodox summons, Drake remarked, seating himself with calculated precision. Some of us have pressing business to attend to. I assure you, Mr. Drake, that no business could be more pressing than that which brings us together tonight, Holmes replied calmly, standing before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. Young Perkins, Whitley's nervous assistant, was our next arrival, followed by Grimshaw, the burly head clerk, who cast a suspicious glance around the room before settling himself near the door. Mrs. Whitley, who had been resting in my room, joined us last, taking a seat near Holmes with quiet dignity. Gentlemen and madam, Holmes began, surveying the assembled company, you are here to witness the resolution of a most remarkable case, one that began with the death of a man who, quite literally, attempted to eat his own words. In that masterful manner which never failed to impress me, Holmes proceeded to unravel the entire scheme, beginning with Whitley's discovery of financial discrepancies and concluding with his desperate attempt to preserve evidence by consuming pages from his journal when he realized he had been poisoned. The business of life assurance, Holmes explained, is founded upon the calculation of probability, the statistical likelihood of death within a given period. Pemberton and Drake Life Assurance, however, found a method of eliminating probability altogether. Rather than wait for chance to determine when policies would pay out, they actively arranged for certain policyholders to die shortly after taking out substantial coverage. A murmur ran through the room, but Holmes continued unperturbed. The scheme required 3 elements. First, the identification of suitable victims, wealthy individuals with few close relations but significant financial difficulties. Second, a method of elimination that would appear to be death by natural causes. And third, a network of beneficiaries who would collect the insurance money and channel a substantial portion back to the architects of the fraud. "This is preposterous," Drake interjected, rising half out of his chair. "You have no evidence for these wild accusations." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, producing Whitley's journal. "I have the meticulous records kept by your late accountant, Mr. Whitley, who discovered your scheme and documented it in code, a code which Mrs. Whitley has kindly helped us to decipher." Holmes handed several sheets of paper to Lestrade. "You will find here the names of 6 individuals whose deaths were arranged over the past 5 years, along with the details of their insurance policies and the subsequent movement of funds. Most damning of all, you will find the name of the company, Orpheus Holdings, through which the funds were channeled back to the partners of Pemberton and Drake." Pemberton had slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, but Drake maintained his icy composure. "Circumstantial at best," he said dismissively. "No court would convict on the basis of a dead man's scribblings." "Perhaps not," Holmes agreed, "but they might convict on the testimony of one Cyrus Maddox, who sold you the poison used to eliminate Mr. Whitley when he came too close to exposing your operation. A poison, I might add, that matches precisely the substance found on the paper fragment recovered from Whitley's mouth." At this, Drake's composure finally cracked. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating his chances of escape, but Lestrade's men moved swiftly to block his path. "There is one thing I do not yet understand," I remarked, as Lestrade began formally charging the 2 partners. "What was Grimshaw's role in all this?" The burly clerk had risen to his feet, his face a mask of resignation. "Merely the instrument, Doctor," Holmes replied. "The man who handled the more practical aspects of the scheme, recruiting the victims, arranging the details, ensuring the smooth flow of funds. A man of many talents, our Mr. Grimshaw, including, I suspect, the ability to apply poison to specific pages of a journal while its owner was temporarily away from his desk." As Lestrade and his men led the prisoners away, Mrs. Whitley remained seated, her composure finally giving way to silent tears. "I still cannot believe Harold is gone," she whispered. "He was such a quiet man, so devoted to his work. I never imagined he would become entangled in something so dangerous." "It was precisely his devotion that cost him his life," Holmes said gently. "His sense of integrity would not allow him to look the other way when he discovered the fraud. By documenting everything in his journal and sending you that final coded message, he ensured that justice would eventually be served." Later, when our visitors had departed and only Mrs. Whitley remained, awaiting a cab to take her to her sister's home, Holmes provided her with one final piece of information. "I have spoken with the directors of the company that will take over Pemberton and Drake's legitimate business," he told her. "They have agreed not only to honor your husband's life insurance policy in full, but also to provide you with an annual pension in recognition of his service. It seems that integrity, even at great cost, may still be rewarded in this cynical age." After Mrs. Whitley had left, Holmes settled into his armchair and reached for his pipe, his features relaxing into that expression of quiet satisfaction that always followed the successful conclusion of a case. "A strange case, Watson," he remarked as blue smoke wreathed his head. "A man who ate paper to preserve evidence, a company that profited from engineered deaths, and a cipher that spoke from beyond the grave to bring the guilty to justice. And yet at its heart a simple tale of greed and its consequences," I observed, pouring us each a measure of brandy. Holmes nodded, gazing thoughtfully into the dying fire. "Indeed, though I shall always remember it as the case of the man with the paper teeth, a testament to how far a decent man will go to preserve the truth even in his final moments. Outside, the fog had lifted, and through the window I could see stars glittering in the cold, clear sky above Baker Street, silent witnesses to the endless drama of human virtue and vice that my friend had dedicated his remarkable life to understanding. Thanks for joining us for The Man with the Paper Teeth. Did you guess the connection between the paper fragments and the insurance fraud before Holmes revealed it? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Sherlock Holmes, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, keep your mind sharp and your coffee strong. This is Alfie signing off from Café Stories.